All right, guys, welcome to part two of this. I didn't mean to make it a two-part thing, but I ended up switching to a bigger piece of paper here. Realized I was running out of room on my 8.5 by 11 there, so we're going to pick up with the second half of this. So up until this point, we talked a little bit about how Madison is really promoting pluralism as a means of democracy, recognizing that there are problems with that, right? His biggest fear is this little guy right here, factions. Factions, he says, are, they're natural to humankind. We are going to break ourselves naturally into groups. We're going to band together with like-minded people, and there's a lot of potential problem with doing that sort of thing. And he said that's, banding together as groups to solve problems is not in and of itself the problem. The problem becomes if one of those can use their numbers to overwhelm a minority and do something really awful or oppressive. So, if we know that there are mischiefs associated with faction, right? If people have, as he talked about it in the paper, people who are united and actuated by a common impulse of passion, adverse to the rights of other citizens. In other words, doing something that is, against what other groups of people want, using, again, their numbers to try and overwhelm another group of people and do something really awful or nefarious. There are mischiefs here that need to be cured. Now, number one, as an option, we can remove its causes, which means destroying liberty or giving everyone the same opinion. We don't want to do that. We can't do that. So we got to move to this other side, and that is controlling factions or removing its effects. So that's where we'll pick up. And I want to break this immediately into two groups, depending on the size of the groups. So we got minority factions, and then we also have majority factions. And of course, I'm not talking about something like racial minority or majority. We're talking about just straight numbers. Minority factions means groups of people that are not in the majority in the total population. All right, so relatively small groups of people. And the reality is we don't worry that much about the mischiefs of small groups, because small groups are more unlikely to get what they want accomplished because they don't have the numbers. If we're a democracy, right, ultimately numbers makes a difference. The more people you have behind an idea, the more likely is that idea is actually going to be, fulfilled. So minority factions are just not a huge concern. We have a mechanism for controlling them, right, with a system like ours. And the mechanism is, elections. You're never going to be able to elect somebody who wants to carry out some oppressive scheme if you're a minority faction, right? And there's plenty of, again, minority factions who represent very, very extreme, sometimes things like racist views. And you know what? We don't worry so much about those factions in a country like ours because you're never going to see some of those extremists, some of those very, strange groups ever coming to power in this country and really getting what they want, because elections will always hold them down. Always, right? So the group that we're worried about is majority factions. Majority factions, at least according to Madison, would be like the mob, right? We're worried about a mob rule scenario. That's Madison's biggest fear, right? How do we prevent mob rule? We definitely don't always want the majority to get their way. And that may sound unusual to you, but if you think about it, there's a lot of sense to that. Just because you're a majority doesn't necessarily mean you're right. All right, think about that. Just because you're a majority doesn't mean that you're right. If a majority of people in this country wanted to deprive people of their religious freedom, well, the majority's wrong in that case, right? So what we really want to make sure is that factions can never use their majority numbers to do something that is contrary to the good of the people or to what's going to be best for this country or in violation to, our Constitution. So how do we prevent majority factions from ever doing something like that? And, again, let me give you kind of a dumb option, just the same way we did on the other side. We could prevent the same interests or passions in the majority. But, the reality is, and he points this out in the paper, we don't want to do that, right? We don't want to step in as a government and force something like that to happen, because in doing so, we'd be depriving some form of liberty, right? So we don't do that. So what we need to do instead is be a little bit sneakier about this. We just simply want to render the majority, and I'm kind of just taking right from the paper here, render the majority unable to carry, his words, something like his schemes into effect. All right, we want to render the majority unable to carry its schemes. You know, scheme is a great word here, right? It's kind of similar to mischiefs, right? They've got these schemes. The majority, the mob, wants to do things. They want to use their numbers to oppress the minority, right? They want to take advantage of the fact that a democratic system favors the majority. But we got to find a way to be a democratic system that somehow doesn't let the mob get its way. Because again, what did I tell you? The mob is not always right. The majority sometimes is wrong, even though they're the majority. So how do we do that? Okay, jump way over here. Let me contrast something. Pure democracy. Pure democracy. This could be kind of like participatory. Pure democracy is more what, you know, like a Brutus is interested in, which means less filter when it comes to the people having access to influence their government. But what Madison is concerned about is that the people have not enough filter, right? We really want there to be more filters to prevent the majority factions from being able to use democracy as a means to oppress people. So we don't like this. Instead, he suggests we do republic. And so Fed 10 is definitely a big paper for republicanism. It's necessary to keep our system functioning effectively. And, you know, it does a couple of things for us. You know, obviously we use elected officials. And what elected officials really do for us is they will, this is the word he uses, refine the public view. Refine is a good word. You know, it basically means it will clean it up. It will filter it. You know, it's more or less what we're saying here. Filter the public's view. It won't be so raw, right? And a republic solves that problem for us, right? We have some sort of a go-between or a filtration between the people and the government, and that's these people, and they will tidy things up. They will clean things up because the public sometimes, in terms of what they want and how they want to accomplish it, is not terribly clean. But I wouldn't say that there is a huge disagreement, even though I told you this is a little bit more participatory. I don't think that even Brutus thought that a pure democracy was a good option for our country. And, you know, part of that is to do with the fact that, again, he recognizes the size problem, right? We're a huge country, and the larger the country, the more unlikely pure democracy is really going to work. It's part of the reason he wants the governments to be as small as possible so that we can be more like this, but he wasn't really fighting too much against a Republican form of government. So that will take me into my last kind of breakout here, which is small republic versus a large republic. And this is where you see the difference really between, I can't see there, the difference really between the arguments of Madison in Federalist number 10 and the arguments of Brutus in Brutus 1, or Robert Yates in Brutus 1. Small republic. There's a problem that Madison is going to point out in this situation. So if you were thinking last time when we were talking about the arguments, if you were thinking, there's a lot of sense to that, right? A government should be really close to the people, represent similar groups of people. It will be more likely to solve their problems if it's a really small republic. Madison's got a problem. And he says, in these type of scenarios, where very small groups of people make up the republic, it is much more likely that the people can be fooled by what he calls, a charlatan, or somebody that comes in saying one thing, but really practicing something different, a corrupting person. It is easier to fool a small group of people than it is to fool a large group of people. And I think that just makes sense, right? It's easier to fool a small group of people than it is a large group of people. That's why generally, at least up until recently, We've had very, very moderate people at the national level when it comes to like our presidents and whatnot, and you tend to maybe see occasionally more extreme people entering politics at the very local level. That could be the local of a township or a city or maybe even a state. And the way Madison would describe that is he would say it's more easy to fool a smaller group of people, easier to fool. And so the opposite to that, obviously, in a large group, is it is hard to fool a larger group of people, right? More people are going to be critical of the people who are coming to represent them. So that's one really positive, Madison says, to a large republic. And again, what's he arguing for? A federal national system, right? A very large republic. But I really like his second point the best. It's probably my favorite part of the paper here. And let's find it in the paper and put it on here so that you can see this little section right here. He says, the greater the number of citizens and extent of territory which may be brought within the compass of Republican than of Democratic government, and it is the circumstance principally which renders the factious combinations less to be dreaded in the former than in the later. He says, all those negative things about factions, they're more likely to happen in a larger Republican form of government. He says the smaller the society, the fewer probably will be the distinct parties and interests composing it. All right, so a small republic is going to have fewer differences. It's going to be more similar. That is what Brutus said the strength of a small republic is. But what Madison is saying is that is the weakness. You want diversity of opinion in your republic, and I'll tell you why. He's got a really, really great point here. He says the more frequently will be a majority found in the same party, and the smaller the number of individuals composing a majority, and the smaller the compass within which they are placed, the more easily will they concert and execute their plans of oppression. He says that if you make the republic larger, right, extend the sphere, and you take in a greater variety of parties and interests, you make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens, or if such a common motive exists, it will be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their strength and act in unison. What he's saying that in a small republic, it's much more likely that you will see a majority, a mob, as he calls it. A mob is the majority. It's more likely that you'll see a mob pop up and use their numbers to oppress the minority. But he said if the republic is really large, it is unlikely that a mob like that will pop up because there's too many other things that force them into, disunity. Right? They will be hard pressed to unify. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Let's use the religion example that I did. Let's imagine a majority said, you know what, there's more of one particular religion in this country. Let's use our majority numbers to force our religion on everybody else, right? Violating freedom of religion, one of the principles of our country. The majority, through their numbers, theoretically could do that, right? The mob could do that. But here's the problem. Those people that might be united on that issue are going to be disunited on other issues. What other issues? I don't know, gun rights or, tax policy or foreign policy, welfare state issues, the right to life or choice. There are so many things that divide us because we are such a large people. And what Madison says is that is the ultimate safeguard that protects us from the mischiefs of faction. We're never going to see the mob unify in a large republic. In a small republic, you may see that. You've only got to unify a smaller group of people, and then they're more likely to use their numbers to overwhelm a minority. It's always in smaller groups like that you see some of the worst corruptions of government. But the larger the republic, the more unlikely that people are ever going to be able to band together. They might say, yeah, let's get behind that. And then they say, wait, hold on a second. You think that there should be more gun control? No, I disagree with you on that. And then they're going to fight and they're going to argue and they're never going to unify. He says that it will be more difficult for them to feel their own strength, to act in unison. That will be difficult for them to do. And I think that's just a really, really interesting point. I think it's really insightful. And it's been generally pretty successful. So in this country, we probably are more in the category of pluralist theory. And of course, there is a problem with faction that he points out. right? Factions have the potential of turning into mob rule, and mob rule has the potential to, corrupt our system. We don't want that. So how do we prevent the majority from getting its way? And that is a huge, huge Madisonian thing, right? He believes very much that the majority needs to be restrained, which sounds counter to democracy, because we think of democracy as majority rules. But again, that's not necessarily the case. We don't always want the majority to get its way because the majority is not always right. They need to be rendered unable to carry into effect its schemes, its awful things that they want to do, the mob, right? In a large republic, this guy right here, this is how we do it. This is the ultimate argument right here that we see between Brutus and between Madison, between Brutus 1 and Federalist number 10. This right here is participatory democracy, people more directly connected with less filter. This is more filter, but for very, very good reason. Okay, so that's the difference between the two. Hopefully my little picture here is helpful to you. Hopefully this kind of makes sense. But it always seems like to me the best way to kind of get through Fed 10. So I still want you to read the document, but I like this little guy right here. So anyhow, we'll talk to you.